Well, listen, I've lived long enough to see markets rise, fall, correct themselves, and then surprise everyone all over again. You think you've seen it all, and then something new comes along that reminds you the world's always changing, always moving, always full of surprises. But every now and then, you get a moment where the ground shifts a little. Not because of an earnings report or a quarterly miss, not because of some geopolitical shock halfway around the world, but because a courtroom somewhere quietly draws a line in the sand. And this time, that line was drawn right under the President's Emergency Tariff Authority. The Court of International Trade delivered a ruling that sent a quiet tremor across Washington. It didn't scream, it didn't posture, it didn't hold press conferences or make grand pronouncements. No, it simply went through the statute page by page, line by line, and concluded that the administration had stretched the International Emergency Economic Powers Act too far when it used it to impose broad global tariffs. When courts make decisions like this, it's a little like an auditor walking through a company ledger and saying, something doesn't balance here. You know that feeling when someone's been doing the books a certain way for months, maybe years, and then a fresh set of eyes comes in and says, wait a minute, this doesn't add up. This isn't what the rules say you can do. That's essentially what happened here. The judges found that using the emergency law as a tool for massive worldwide tariff actions created what they called an unbounded delegation of power. See, Congress wrote IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, for targeted emergencies, specific threats, particular situations where the president needs to act quickly to protect national security or respond to a genuine crisis. It wasn't crafted as a blanket permission slip for sweeping economic redesign. It wasn't meant to be a tool for restructuring global trade relationships or implementing a comprehensive tariff strategy across dozens of countries. And so the court said no. That decision struck down two major sets of tariffs, including measures that had been applied to Canada, Mexico, and China. These weren't small, symbolic tariffs. These were substantial duties that were part of the administration's broader trade push, tied into the larger structure of what the White House had been calling the Liberation Day orders, this whole framework of tariffs designed to reshape American trade policy and bring manufacturing back home. And for businesses that had been paying those added costs, companies that had been absorbing millions, sometimes tens of millions of dollars in additional expenses, there was suddenly a very real possibility that they might be entitled to refunds if this ruling gets upheld down the line. Think about what that means for a moment. You're a company that's been paying 25% tariffs on imported goods for months. You've been passing some of that cost to customers, absorbing some of it in your margins, maybe laying off workers or delaying investments because your costs went up so dramatically. And now a court says, actually, those tariffs weren't legally valid in the first place. Suddenly, you're looking at potential refunds, money that could flow back into your business, capital that could be redeployed, but also uncertainty about what happens next because appeals are coming and nothing's final yet. Let me step back and explain why this matters so much, because the legal details here are actually pretty important. IEPA, this law that the court said was stretched too far, has been on the books since 1977, nearly 50 years. It gives a president significant power to regulate international commerce during a national emergency. The key word there is emergency, not whenever it seems like a good idea, not to implement general policy preferences emergency. Throughout its history, IEPA has been used for things like freezing assets of terrorist organizations, imposing sanctions on rogue states, responding to specific threats to national security. Those are targeted actions, specific responses to specific problems. But using it to impose sweeping tariffs on our largest trading partners, Canada, Mexico, China, countries that together account for a huge percentage of U.S. trade, the court looked at that and said, this isn't what Congress intended when it wrote this law. It's a separation of powers issue at its core. Congress has the constitutional authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations. That's explicitly in the Constitution. Now, Congress can delegate some of that authority to the executive branch. They can say, Mr. President, in certain emergency situations, we're giving you the power to act quickly without waiting for us to pass new legislation. But that delegation has to have limits. It can't be so broad that it effectively transfers all of Congress's commerce power to the President permanently. That violates a basic democratic principle, and that's what the court found here. The way IEEPA was being used created an unbounded delegation. It gave the President essentially unlimited power to reshape trade policy however he wanted just by declaring an emergency. That violates fundamental principles of how our government is supposed to work. It concentrates too much power in one branch without meaningful checks from the others. Now, the White House obviously disagrees with this ruling. They're going to appeal. They'll argue that the President does have this authority, that the national security justifications are real and substantial, that the court misread the statute. And maybe they'll win on appeal. Maybe a higher court will see it differently. These things are rarely black and white, but for now, right now, today, this ruling stands, and it creates enormous uncertainty across the entire trade landscape. Companies that have been restructuring their supply chains to avoid tariffs, they're now wondering if they need to keep doing that or if the tariffs might disappear. Foreign governments that have been negotiating with the U.S. on trade issues, they're watching this closely to understand how stable American trade policy actually is. Investors trying to value companies that are heavily affected by trade policy, they've got a whole new variable to factor into their models. And workers and unions that have been supporting these tariffs because they see them as bringing jobs home, well, they're nervous that the legal foundation might be crumbling underneath the whole strategy. It's uncertainty, and as I've said many times over the years, markets hate uncertainty. Businesses hate uncertainty. You can plan around bad news. You can adjust to higher costs or lower revenues. But when you don't know what the rules are going to be, when you can't predict whether today's policy will still be in effect 6 months from now, that's when things get really difficult. Now, let me tell you what this reminds me of, because I've seen similar patterns play out over decades of investing and watching how markets interact with policy. There was a case years ago, a challenge to one of FDR's New Deal programs. The Supreme Court struck down key parts of the National Industrial Recovery Act, saying Congress had delegated too much power to the executive branch. Without sufficient standards or limits, FDR was furious. His whole economic recovery program was built on those delegated powers, and when the court said no, it threw everything into chaos for a while. Eventually, some of those programs got restructured with clearer congressional authorization. Others just ended. But the principle that emerged was important. Even in an emergency, even when swift action is needed, there are limits to how much power can be concentrated in the executive branch without meaningful checks. This case echoes that same principle. The court is saying, yes, the president has significant authority, but no, that authority isn't unlimited. There have to be boundaries. And those boundaries matter not just for this particular set of tariffs, but for how our system of government functions more broadly. Now, from an investor's perspective, because that's how a lot of people are going to evaluate this, the question becomes, what does this ruling do to valuations and risk assessments? If you're holding shares in companies that are heavily exposed to international trade, this ruling injects a new level of uncertainty. Are the tariffs staying? Are they going? Will they be replaced with something else? That uncertainty affects how you model future cash flows. It affects the discount rate you apply to those cash flows. It makes it harder to have confidence in your projections. And when investors lose confidence in their ability to project future performance, they demand a higher return to compensate for that uncertainty, which means valuations come down. We saw some of that in market reaction already. Not a crash, nothing dramatic, but shifts in certain sectors, adjustments in how people are positioning their portfolios. The companies most directly affected: importers, exporters, manufacturers with complex international supply chains. Their stocks moved, sometimes up, sometimes down, depending on how investors think this ruling affects their specific situation. And that's going to continue as this works its way through the appeals process and as the legal uncertainty persists. Now, here's what I find particularly interesting about the court's reasoning, because it's not just about tariffs, it's about how we think about emergency powers more generally. For the past few decades, really accelerating since 9/11, there's been a gradual expansion of executive authority during emergencies. Presidents of both parties have pushed the boundaries of what they can do without explicit congressional authorization. Sometimes that's necessary. Genuine emergencies require quick action, and Congress can be slow and deliberative by design. But there's a risk that emergency becomes the new normal, that powers granted for exceptional circumstances become routine tools of governance. And when that happens, the balance of power shifts in ways that our constitutional system wasn't designed for. This court ruling pushes back against that trend. It says, no, you can't use emergency powers as a general-purpose policy tool. Emergencies have to be actual emergencies, not just situations where acting through normal legislative channels would be inconvenient or difficult. That's an important check. And regardless of how you feel about these specific tariffs, whether you think they're good policy or bad policy, having courts willing to enforce limits on executive power is healthy for the system. Now, the practical question that everyone's asking is, what happens next? The administration will appeal, that's certain. This will go to a higher court, probably eventually to the Supreme Court if the issues are significant enough. In the meantime, there's going to be confusion. Some tariffs might stay in place while the appeals proceed. Others might be suspended. Companies will have to make decisions about their operations without knowing for sure what the legal landscape will look like 6 months or a year from now. And Congress might actually have to do its job. If these tariffs are going to be policy, if they're going to be part of America's trade strategy going forward, then Congress might need to pass legislation explicitly authorizing them. That would require debate, hearings, votes, the normal legislative process. Some people see that as a feature, not a bug. They think major policy decisions should go through that process, with all its messiness and compromise and public input. Others see it as impossibly slow and dysfunctional, a recipe for gridlock and inaction. But that's the system we have. And this court ruling is basically saying, use the system. Don't try to shortcut it by stretching emergency powers beyond recognition. For businesses, for workers, for everyone trying to plan their economic future, this ruling means more uncertainty in the short term, but potentially more stability and predictability in the long term if it forces policy to go through proper channels with clear legal foundations. And for someone like me who's spent a lifetime studying how markets and policy interact, it's a reminder that legal structures matter, institutions matter, checks and balances matter. You can't just assume that policy will stay consistent or that authority is unlimited. There are always constraints, always boundaries, always someone, a court, Congress, voters who might say, wait a minute, that's not how this is supposed to work. Now, here is where the story takes one of those institutional turns that people don't always appreciate right away. The ruling didn't end the matter, not even close. The administration appealed immediately, and I mean immediately. Within hours, the legal teams were filing papers, making arguments, requesting urgent review, and the moment that appeal reached the Federal Circuit, the next level up in the court system, the judges there granted a temporary administrative stay. Now, what does that mean in plain English? It means that tariffs, for now, remain in place. The system is still breathing. Nothing has collapsed. Nothing has rolled back yet. It's simply in a kind of legal suspension, a pause button, if you will, while the courts figure out what comes next. And I've seen this. pattern before. Many times over the years, whenever one branch of government draws a boundary, another branch steps forward to test its strength. It's not hostility necessarily. It's not even dysfunction really. It's the system adjusting itself, finding its balance, working through disagreements, the way our founders intended. It's the same dynamic you find in the boardroom when a compliance officer challenges a strategic plan. Someone says, "Wait, can we actually do this legally?" And then you have to stop and figure it out before moving forward. That tension between ambition and constraint, between action and authorization, that's actually healthy. It's uncomfortable, sure. It creates uncertainty, but it prevents any one part of the system from running completely unchecked. Now, what made this ruling particularly important wasn't its volume or its drama. The judges didn't write some sweeping manifesto. They didn't make grand pronouncements about presidential power or the future of trade policy. No, what made it important was its clarity, its precision. The trade court warned that allowing a president to use IEPA to impose sweeping tariffs of global scope would grant power of vast economic significance without clear congressional approval. And that phrase, vast economic significance, that's become a key concept in recent court decisions. It's part of what lawyers call the major questions doctrine. You see, courts have been increasingly cautious about allowing presidents to make big economic moves when Congress hasn't spoken explicitly. The reasoning is pretty straightforward. If a decision has enormous economic and political consequences, Congress should be the one making it, not unelected officials in the executive branch. And here the court drew a very careful distinction. It didn't deny that emergencies exist. It didn't strip the presidency of its power to respond to genuine crises. It simply said that in this specific law, IEPA, Congress did not authorize a step that big. It's a narrow ruling in some ways, but it's also profound in its implications. Because what the court is essentially saying is, show us where Congress gave you permission to do something this consequential. We need to see explicit authorization, not just vague language that could theoretically be stretched to cover this situation. That's a higher bar, a more demanding standard, and it could reshape how presidents think about using executive authority for major economic policy. Now, this has real consequences for the markets, even if traders are too busy with their dashboards and their algorithms to see it immediately. Markets react to news, they respond to events, but they don't always digest the deeper structural shifts that determine the long-term landscape. If this ruling is upheld after appeal, and that's still a big if, it could reshuffle the entire logic behind how presidents use trade leverage. It could force future administrations to justify economic actions with more precision, more legislative grounding, more statutory clarity. You can't just declare an emergency and do whatever you want. You have to show that Congress actually gave you the authority for the specific thing you're trying to do. And when the law tightens the perimeter like that, when the boundaries get more clearly defined, the market has to recalibrate its risk assumptions. Investors who've been betting that presidential trade authority is essentially unlimited, they might need to rethink that. Companies that have been planning around the assumption that tariffs can be imposed or removed at presidential whim, they might need to factor in more constraints, more checks, more uncertainty about whether those actions will survive legal challenge. It's not a dramatic shift that happens overnight, but it's a gradual recalibration of what's possible, what's likely, what's legally sustainable. Now, this is also where things get a little more delicate, because the decision wasn't as sweeping as some of the headlines made it sound. The court did not touch tariffs imposed under other authorities, measures tied to the Trade, Expansion Act, or other statutes. Those remain untouched. They weren't part of this case. They weren't challenged in this ruling. The court's language was narrow, technical, and disciplined. It addressed IEPA and nothing more. So the narrative that everything falls apart, that executive power has been cut off at the source, that the entire tariff structure is collapsing, well, that's not what happened. That's not what the court did. The system didn't crack. It exhaled slowly and drew a boundary. It said, this far and no further, at least not without clearer authorization. But there's still plenty of room for action within other legal frameworks. The president still has significant trade authority under different statutes. Congress could pass new legislation explicitly authorizing broader tariffs if it chose to. The game hasn't ended. The rules have just been clarified a bit. The boundaries have been marked a little more clearly. And you know what? That's probably healthy, even if it's inconvenient for whoever is trying to implement policy at the moment. Because when rules are clear, when boundaries are defined, everyone can plan better. Businesses know what's allowed and what isn't. Investors can model scenarios with more confidence. Foreign governments understand what they're negotiating against. Uncertainty is reduced, even if flexibility is constrained. Now, let me tell you what I find particularly interesting about how the court framed its reasoning, because it reveals something important about the judge's thinking. They didn't say the tariffs were bad policy. They didn't make an economic judgment about whether bringing manufacturing home or reshaping trade relationships is a good idea or a bad idea. That's not their job. Courts don't decide policy, merits. They decide legal questions. What they said was much narrower. We don't see clear statutory authorization for this particular use of presidential power. That's a process argument, not a substance argument. It's about procedure, about following the proper channels, about having the right legal foundation before taking major action. And that distinction matters, because it means this isn't really about tariffs at all. It's about constitutional structure. It's about how power is distributed in our system and what checks exist to prevent any one branch from accumulating too much authority. The tariffs are just the vehicle through which that larger question is being litigated. And that larger question, how much power does the president have to reshape the economy without explicit congressional authorization, that's going to keep coming up in different contexts. Environmental regulations, immigration policy, healthcare rules, financial regulations. All of these areas involve presidents pushing the boundaries of their authority and courts having to decide whether they've gone too far. This trade court decision is part of that broader pattern, and depending on how the appeals play out, it could establish precedent that affects executive power well beyond just trade policy. Now, I want to come back to that administrative stay for a moment, because it's important to understand what it does and doesn't mean. The stay keeps the tariffs in place while the appeal proceeds. So businesses that were hoping for immediate relief, they're not getting it. The costs they've been paying continue, but the stay is temporary. It's not a ruling on the merits. It's just a decision to maintain the status quo while the higher court considers the arguments. The Federal Circuit could ultimately affirm the trade court's decision, in which case the tariffs would come down, or it could reverse, in which case they'd stay up with firmer legal foundation. Or it could send the case back for further proceedings with different instructions. All of those outcomes are still on the table. And until we get that final ruling, which could take months, we're in this state of suspended animation. The tariffs are there, but they're legally uncertain. Companies have to decide whether to plan around them staying or going. Investors have to price in multiple scenarios. It's uncomfortable, it's ambiguous, but it's also how the legal system works. Cases take time, appeals go through layers of review, and in the meantime, everyone has to operate with incomplete information. Now, from a Buffett perspective, thinking about how someone focused on long-term value would view this situation, there's actually something reassuring about courts willing to enforce limits. You see, one of the biggest risks in any investment is that the rules change unexpectedly. You make a bet based on one set of assumptions about how the world works, and then suddenly the government changes the rules and your investment thesis falls apart. Having courts that enforce clear boundaries, that require explicit authorization for major changes, that prevent any single actor from reshaping the landscape on a whim that actually reduces long-term risk. It makes the system more predictable, even if any particular outcome becomes less certain in the short term. You'd rather operate in a world where the rules are clear and enforced than in a world where powerful actors can do whatever they want whenever they want. That's true in business. It's true in investing. And it's true in how government policy affects the economy. So, while this ruling creates short-term uncertainty about these specific tariffs, it potentially creates long-term stability by reinforcing that there are limits, that checks exist, that power isn't unlimited. And for someone thinking decades ahead, the way Buffett always does, that institutional strength, that commitment to boundaries and process that's actually valuable, it's the kind of thing that makes a country a better place to invest long-term, even if it complicates specific policy implementation in the moment. Now, I don't want to overstate the significance here. This is one ruling in one case about one statute. It's not the end of presidential trade authority. It's not a fundamental restructuring of how our government works. But it is a data point, a signal, a reminder that even in an era of expansive executive power, there are still institutions willing to say, "Show me the authorization." And that matters not just for these tariffs, but for how the system functions more broadly, for how power is checked and balanced, for how we maintain a government of laws rather than just a government of whoever happens to hold power at any given moment. The tariffs are still there for now. The stay keeps them in place, but the legal foundation is shakier than it was before. And that uncertainty, that requirement to justify authority rather than just assert it, that's filtering through the system in ways that will have ripples far beyond just trade policy. And yet, when boundaries are drawn, when courts step in and say, "Wait a minute, let's look at this more carefully," speculation begins to swirl almost immediately. You start hearing quiet whispers about how this might affect broader executive strategies. People in Washington talking over coffee, analysts writing memos that don't quite make the headlines but circulate among people who follow these things closely. You hear analysts saying, could this change the White House's negotiating leverage? Because if foreign governments think these tariffs might not survive legal challenge, does that weaken America's position at the bargaining table? You hear investors asking whether the administration's broader trade posture might be forced to recalibrate, whether they need to rely more on Congress, more on other legal authorities, more on negotiation rather than unilateral action. Now, these are not claims of collapse. Nobody serious is saying the sky is falling or that presidential authority has been destroyed. They're simply the natural chatter that comes when a major tool in the executive toolbox is being tested in court, when something that seemed solid suddenly looks less certain. It's the market trying to price in new information. It's policymakers adjusting their assumptions. It's the whole system responding to a shift in the landscape. And then there is Congress, which hasn't exactly been the most proactive institution in recent years when it comes to clarifying executive authority. But legislators now face a moment where they must decide whether they want to clarify the statute or just leave it to the courts to keep shaping the boundaries case by case. See, in earlier years, really for decades, Congress often allowed presidents broad discretion in foreign economic matters. The thinking was, trade policy and international economics move fast. You need flexibility. The president can act quickly, where Congress would get bogged down in debate and partisan wrangling. So Congress delegated a lot of authority and mostly stayed out of the way. But this time, the court has hinted pretty strongly that such discretion has limits, that delegation can't be unlimited, that at some point the decisions are too big and too consequential to happen without explicit congressional say-so. And now Congress may need to either reaffirm those limits or redraw them entirely. Do they want to give the president clearer, broader authority, or do they want to rein things in, reassert their own constitutional role in regulating commerce? That's a choice, a political choice with real consequences, and it's one they can't avoid forever, especially if this court ruling stands. The branches are speaking softly to each other, but the message is serious. The judiciary is saying to the executive, show us your authorization. And it's saying to Congress, if you want presidents to have this power, you need to say so explicitly. That's constitutional dialogue happening in real time. It's not dramatic, it's not theatrical, but it's profound in its implications for how our government actually works. Now, what has not happened, despite all the dramatic framing out there, all the hot takes and breathless headlines, is a constitutional earthquake. This was a statutory ruling built on the language Congress wrote. The judges looked at IEPA, read what it says, examined its history and purpose, and concluded it doesn't authorize what the Congress administration tried to do with it. That's a narrow, technical, legal conclusion. It's not a philosophical rejection of executive power. It's not the courts trying to hamstring the presidency or prevent action during genuine emergencies. It was simply the judiciary doing what the judiciary does best, reading the law with precision, applying it to facts, and reaching a conclusion based on what the statute actually says rather than what someone wishes it said. And the appeals process will do what it always does, testing whether that reasoning holds when viewed from higher benches, from different judicial perspectives, with more comprehensive arguments. Maybe the Federal Circuit agrees with the trade court's reading. Maybe they see it differently. Maybe the Supreme Court eventually weighs in with the final word. That process takes time. It involves briefing and oral arguments and judicial deliberation. But that's how it's supposed to work. And in the meantime, everyone operates in this space of legal uncertainty, trying to plan for multiple possible futures. But make no mistake, this is a moment of institutional significance, even if it's not the crisis some people are portraying it as. The presidency's most flexible economic instrument has been challenged, not destroyed, not eliminated, but challenged, questioned, required to justify itself under closer scrutiny. The courts have reminded the executive that emergency authority is not a blank check, that there are limits, boundaries, requirements for authorization that have to be met. And businesses now wait in a kind of suspended animation, watching to see whether the higher courts reinforce that boundary or rewrite it. Do the tariffs stay? Do they go? Does the legal foundation get stronger or weaker as this works through the appeals process? Nobody knows for certain. And that uncertainty affects planning, affects investment decisions, affects how companies think about their supply chains and their strategies. It's uncomfortable, but it's also, in a way, the system working as designed, with checks, with balances, with multiple institutions each playing their role in determining what the law allows. And I suppose that is why I wanted to walk through the facts carefully, step by step, without the drama and the hyperbole that you see in a lot of coverage. Because when the noise gets loud, when everyone's shouting and spinning and trying to fit events into their preferred narrative, the truth becomes the only stable footing. Everything else is quicksand. But the facts, the actual details of what happened and what it means, those give you something solid to stand on. And the truth here is steady. It's not exciting, but it's reliable. A court drew a line. It said IEPA doesn't authorize sweeping global tariffs without clear congressional approval. An appeal put the ruling on pause. The Federal Circuit granted a stay, keeping tariffs in place while they consider the arguments. And the final outcome, which could take months to resolve, will shape the next era of trade policy, determining how much flexibility presidents have and what kind of authorization they need from Congress to take major economic actions. That's what actually happened. No more, no less. Not a crisis, not a triumph. Just the legal system grinding through a difficult question about the boundaries of executive authority. For you, for investors watching this, for anyone trying to understand what it means for markets and the economy, I think there are a few key takeaways. First, legal uncertainty is now a bigger factor in trade policy than it was before. You can't just assume that tariffs announced by the president will necessarily stick. Courts might intervene. Authorization might be questioned. That means more risk, more volatility, more scenarios to consider when you're modeling how policy affects your investments. Second, the timeline matters. These legal processes take time, months, sometimes years, and during that time, the status quo often persists, even while its legal foundation is being questioned. So, you can't just react to each ruling as if it's the final word. You have to think probabilistically, considering multiple possible outcomes and how long it might take to reach resolution. Third, institutional strength matters more than immediate outcomes. A system where courts enforce meaningful limits, where power is checked and balanced, where no single actor can reshape everything unilaterally, that's a more stable system long term, even if it's more uncertain short term. And stability, predictability, the rule of law, those things have value. They make a country a better place to do business, a safer place to invest, a more reliable foundation for building long-term wealth. So while this ruling creates complications for current trade policy, it also reinforces that the system has checks, that limits exist, that authority has to be justified, not just asserted. And that's worth something, even if it's hard to put a price tag on it. Now, I've been doing this long enough to know that most people won't follow every twist and turn of the legal proceedings. They'll catch headlines, they'll hear sound bites, they'll get the broad strokes, but not the details. And that's fine. That's normal. Not everyone needs to be a legal expert or a trade policy specialist. But for those who do care about understanding what's really happening, who want to see past the spin and get to the substance, I think it's important to walk through things carefully, to distinguish between what actually happened and what people claim happened, to separate signal from noise, because that's where insight comes from, not from the loudest voices or the most dramatic takes, but from careful attention to what's actually true. A court questioned presidential authority under one specific statute. An appeal paused the effect of that ruling, and the legal process will continue until we get a final answer about what the law allows. Everything else, all the speculation about negotiating leverage and congressional response and market implications, that's secondary. Important, yes. Worth thinking about, absolutely. But secondary to the core facts of what actually occurred. And those facts are pretty straightforward once you cut through the noise. The system is working. Checks are being applied. Boundaries are being tested and defined. And the outcome will clarify, one way or another, what authority exists and what limits constrain it. That's not a crisis. It's not a catastrophe. It's just government functioning the way it's supposed to, with different branches playing their roles, with disagreements being resolved through legal process rather than force or fiat. And for my money, for anyone thinking about the long-term health of the economy and the markets, that's actually reassuring, even when the short-term uncertainty is uncomfortable. Because systems that work, that have meaningful checks, that require justification and authorization rather than just accepting assertions of power, those systems tend to be more stable, more predictable, more trustworthy over the long run. And that stability, that predictability, that basic rule of law, well, that's the foundation everything else is built on. Without it, you've got chaos. With it, even when things are messy and uncertain for a while, you've got a structure that can work through problems and reach sustainable solutions. So as this case works its way through the courts, as Congress decides whether to act, as the administration adjusts its strategies, I'll be watching not just for who wins or loses on the specific question of tariffs, but for what it tells us about the strength of our institutions and the resilience of the system that underpins everything we do. Because that's what really matters in the long run. Not any single policy outcome, but whether the system itself is healthy, whether checks still function, whether power remains bounded by law rather than just limited by political will. And based on what I've seen so far, the system's doing its job. It's not pretty, it's not fast, but it's working. And that's worth more than most people realize.